I'm going to start the and we'll get started. So in our webinar today, we encourage you to ask questions and share comments in the chat. And our team will do our best to address your questions during the Q&A portion. So please make sure your Zoom name is your actual name, including your organization, so that we can all get to know each other. Your video may be on or off, but we always encourage cameras on for a more personalized experience. But although we would like cameras on, please stay muted until we get to the Q&A portion of our event. And the session is recorded, and the recordings will be sent out to registrants and participants after today's session with a quick survey about our event today. So now I would like to welcome my co-facilitators. This afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, we're joined by Katie Buckley from Teach for America, Elisa Hussein from Unbound Ed, Laura Miley from Leading Educators, and Shay Worthman from Teaching Lab. On the Ripple side, we're joined by Stacey Alicea, Ripple's Executive Director, Nate Schwartz from the Annenberg Institute, and I'm Krista Morales. If I haven't met you already, I'm Ripple's Network Engagement and Learning Manager. So in this session, we'll discuss the contents of Ripple's latest publication, white paper, Measuring Teacher Professional Learning, Why It's Hard and What We Can Do About It. And then a good chunk of our time we'll be hearing from our org representatives about the case studies they shared in the paper. And then we'll then end with 10 minutes of Q&A and close out. So with that, I will turn it over to Stacey.
Thanks, Krista. So today, just want to talk a bit about Ripple before we get started. Ripple is a growing network working together to advance educational equity through the study and integration of professional learning design features, which are proven to increase equitable instructional practices in classrooms. Together, we aim to positively impact student learning and development, especially for students pushed to the margins of our education system. And on the right, you'll see a picture of our growing network. We have our 6 member orgs, many of whom are presenting today, as well as 67 affiliates and growing. We are supported by a research advisory council of 11 members, and we also want to just give thanks to our funders who help us do this great work. Okay, so at Ripple, we care about teacher and educator professional learning. We know that without teachers, we cannot improve student learning. Teachers are the most important school-based factor in advancing student learning and student social emotional development. And so we know that as teachers improve, so do students. Teachers themselves are learners. At Ripple, we believe that if we can improve the learning conditions for adult learning, that will lead to us having better professional learning for teachers sustaining improvement in their practices around professional learning, and then in turn, improved and more equitable student learning and development. So why did we at Ripple decide to do a measurement paper? Well, in order to change the things that we're seeking to change, thinking about high quality instructional materials coupled with high quality professional learning, we need to be able to measure those things, the quality of professional learning, teacher instructional practices, how students are experiencing those practices in their classroom. We cannot do that without being able to measure those things. And so increasingly, there have been calls for more rigorous measurement of teacher professional learning in the field that often ignore the challenges associated with measurement, both technical and substantive, particularly in schools and districts. We see our professional learning organizations as critical resources in solving these measurement challenges. They are often untapped resources. We believe they're critical because they are working alongside districts, schools, and teachers. They understand the day-to-day context and are well situated to surface these challenges and help us think about how we problem solve around them. And so for this reason, we centered our measurement white paper around their voices. How do we approach this paper? So, as I mentioned, we have 6 member orgs and over 67 affiliates and growing. We reached out to our Ripple network and we invited professional learning organizations to join a measurement work group to explore the challenges that they were facing in measurement, as well as to discuss the ways that they're innovating to try to problem solve. We came together and in this body decided that we would write a paper and talk about these things. And so in this paper, we aim to describe the measurement challenges that our organizations confront and offer views from inside those organizations about where there are opportunities for improvement. Alongside that, we highlight real-world examples from each of these organizations that show how they're using and developing innovative, practical, equity-focused measures to address the challenges that they face. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Krista, who will talk a bit more about the challenges that are discussed in the paper.
All right, thanks, Stacey. So in conversation with each other, the organizations within our working group discuss their experiences with measurement. Those conversations led to the group identifying 5 key measurement challenges they often encounter within their respective organizations. So misalignment of research priorities, lack of practical measurement tools, insufficient attention to equitable measurement, variation across district partnerships, and of course, capacity constraints. So in a perfect world, we would have aligned measures and processes to mitigate these challenges and meet the needs of all our schools, teachers, and students. But the reality is we're working in contexts where time and capacity for data collection and analysis is limited and where privacy rules rightfully require considerable protections for sharing information. So our list of challenges in the white paper is by no means an exhaustive list of the measurement challenges in the PL field, but the consensus among our working group was that we still don't have the measures necessary to capture the data we need to evaluate the implementation, outcomes, and impact of PL programs. So as a result, our orgs tried to develop and pick measurement instruments that can meet multiple needs simultaneously. So after identifying the challenges, we highlighted some of the central tensions that make it more difficult for our organizations to achieve the kinds of data-driven improvement work that we believe would help support students, teachers, and school leaders. So in this section of the paper, we outlined in more detail areas of opportunity that we want researchers and practitioners to take up and act on in the coming years. So similar to Ripple's past briefs, our white paper focused on the what, so the content of the measures, and the how, the properties of measures. In terms of the what, the first being that we need more measurement tools that prioritize student well-being across cultures and contexts, and this would allow for research on student outcomes outside of traditional measures of academic achievement. While we recognize, of course, that the importance of assessment data assessment data alone can't capture the growth and progress of teacher practice and student achievement. There's also a need to couple observational data from the observer's point of view with direct evidence from students' experiences of the learning environment, with specific attention to the experiences of historically marginalized student groups. Our organization shared the need for observational tools that can be, one, easily normed across schools and raters, whether used virtually or synchronously. 2, easily used to train school leaders to observe instructional practices and student experiences of the learning environment. And 3, used by schools and districts even after PL organizations are no longer providing support. So thinking about the sustainability aspect of PL. The third area is naming the triangulation of data sources as critical when using surveys and other self-report measures for teachers and students, because a common concern with some survey measures is that they're biased. So triangulating data sources would help reduce those concerns. However, in order to realize the promise of survey data, while also striving to disrupt bias, we name that students and teachers should be at the center of measurement. So a great example of this, which we referenced in the paper, is Nicole Joseph and Elizabeth Anderson's Measuring Inclusive Constructs of Mathematics Identity, or the MICME project, in which they interviewed students and created measures of Black girls' mathematical identities, and in doing so, provided timely and actionable information to teachers on how race, gender, and disciplinary belonging intersect. So in terms of the properties of the measures and how we measure, there were 4 areas folks identified were key to practical and equitable measurement. So the first is that the field needs more measures that are short, concise, and mutually beneficial, because schools and school systems generate and use vast amounts of data, which requires considerable time and resources to collect and analyze. And to get to the mutually beneficial piece, our organizations want to learn and grow in the same ways our schools want to learn and grow. Therefore, measures should help create stronger partnerships and learning opportunities between PL providers and schools and districts. Second, which supports what we had said earlier about students and teachers needing to be at the center of measurement, because in order to actualize that, we need measurement processes that honor students and teachers' voices by returning their data back to them in useful and timely ways. So in that vein, our orgs explain that timeliness of measures is key to providing real value for practitioners. Teachers need practical tools that'll help support them make short-term or immediate adjustments in their classrooms. And as a former teacher, I can attest to the need for lightweight, flexible, and easily implementable measures to ensure that I'm getting the support I need and I'm supporting my students in a timely and targeted manner. Lastly, we would also like to see measurement libraries that include different sets of tools for different ages of students to enable developmentally appropriate data collection. So our districts, schools, and classrooms are beautifully diverse, so our measures should target, account for, and address variation in those diverse classrooms and contexts. And this can be done through differentiated surveys and interview protocols like Leading Educators does, and they go more in depth in that about that in our paper. So the what's missing in the field opportunities to innovate section of our paper was also the section where we relied on case studies to paint the picture of what's happening within our organizations when they're on the ground. So member and affiliate organizations gave examples and provided real world scenarios of how they're addressing these measurement issues. And I put that link in the chat. Which is a great segue actually to discussing our case studies and highlighting the organizations that could be with us today. So today we have representatives from Teaching Lab, Unbound Ed, Teach for America, and Leading Educators. And each of our representatives will discuss their case study in greater detail. And again, we'll have some time at the end for you all to ask them questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shay to kick us off with Teaching Lab's case study.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Shay Worthman, and I'm Senior Director of Learning and Research at Teaching Lab. As part of this white paper, we wanted to provide an example of the types of data that PL organizations collect, how and on what schedule for program evaluation. So many PL organizations like Teaching Lab have developed comprehensive frameworks that guide this. And in the case of Teaching Lab, our evaluation plan is rooted in the Guskey framework. And I will drop in the chat a link to an article in case you are unfamiliar with the Guskey framework or would like to brush up on it. So the Guskey framework is straightforward. It's easy to understand. There's 5 different levels that Guskey proposes collecting data on: participant reactions, participant learning, organizational support and change, and participants' use of new knowledge and skills, and student learning outcomes. So on the next slide, please. Here we have how Teaching Lab has adapted the Guskey framework to guide what we call our theory of evaluation. So the first is very similar to the Guskey framework. Here we're looking at participant perceptions. We think it's very important, right, that educators are finding valuable the different services that we are providing. So we collect this data through participant feedback surveys at the end of sessions, courses, and throughout our coaching cycles. The way that Teaching Lab conceptualizes participant learning is in points, the second and third points here. First, we look at whether educators participating in our PL are increasing their content and pedagogical content knowledge through course assessments. So we have 3 to 5 question quizzes that are aligned to the core learning of a PL course, and we administer that the first and the last day of a course. We also look at how participants are shifting their mindsets over time. We gather this at the beginning and the end of the year in our educator survey. We look at things such as teachers having high expectations for all students, teachers' recognition of race and culture of their students in order to leverage that in their instruction, among other mindsets that we find aligned to our values in our PL. For organizational support and change, we think of this as enabling conditions. We have a set of 6 enabling conditions that we track over the course of our partnerships. We look at things such as coherent instructional vision. Does the partner have sacred time for PL? The use of observation, feedback, and coaching cycles that allow for teacher growth, among others. So notably, these first 4 aspects that we have here can be gathered, or most of this can be gathered through surveys of participants, and they're done at different times and on different schedules, but by and large, the instruments that we're using are surveys. Levels 5 and 6 here are collected in different ways, and the collection of this data really depends on the scope of work that we have with a partner. So this data, is collected for some, but not all of our partners. For the 5th part here, we're looking at participant practice. So we observe teachers using observational tools such as the IPG and the FSOT. We observe all teachers that we coach at least 3 times per year in order to determine whether and how their instructional practices are shifting. And then finally, we're hoping that if we're moving the needle on all of this, that we're going to be impacting student learning experiences. And there we look at 3 different things at Teaching Lab. We look at student surveys. So students are responding to, how they feel in their classroom, the relationship with their teachers. We analyze student work samples to understand the work that students are being assigned and then their performance on these tasks. And finally, for some partners, we have the opportunity to analyze formative and summative assessment data. The next slide goes into more detail of what I've been explaining and can be explored on your own time, but the top part there lists the different areas and constructs that we look at, and then the bottom part provides information of how we measure them. The next slide here, as I wrap up, so we have found that the Guskey framework is easy to understand. It's also quite linear, and there's an assumption that success at one level leads to success at subsequent levels, and we have a lot to still explore there. We're really not sure, for example, how do mindset shifts interact with shifts in instructional practices? What comes first? How do they influence one another? And finally, while the Guskey framework can provide broad guidance on how to measure these pre-post changes, we know that truly evaluating the impact requires us to compare outcomes to meaningful comparison groups in more rigorous ways. And I will now pass it off to Eliza from Unbound Ed.
Thanks, Jay. Hi, everyone. I'm Eliza Hussain. I'm the Vice President of Research and Evaluation at Unbound Ed Core, and I'm really happy to be here. So a lot of us professional learning organizations work really hard to measure the effects of our offerings. But that requires us either to build measurement tools and instruments on our own or borrow from the field and then tweak them to fit our context. We don't, Stacy mentioned this earlier, but we don't really have a bank of measurement tools that really align well to our work. So Unbound Ed Core did some of this work. We pulled a tool that was existing in the field and then tried to understand how do we align it to our work. So we pulled the Teacher Knowledge of Early Literacy Skills, TKELS, to measure improvements in teacher knowledge before and after they attended a program. So CORE, which is a subsidiary of Unbound Ed, offers the Online Elementary Reading Academy, or OERA. It's part of the core literacy program, and we work to improve teacher knowledge. And so we wanted to measure whether teacher knowledge improves as a result of this program. When we took the TKELS, and I should mention that NWA introduced us to the TKELS through some work that they had done earlier on with core learning. When we pulled the TKELS, we modified some questions to align with our work. But when we modified questions of an existing instrument, we had to answer some pretty intense questions around whether the modified assessment now actually measures the constructs that our program tries to teach. And does the modified assessment consistently measure the things that we're trying to teach? Next slide, please. So to assess and understand these questions a little bit better, we traced the origins of the assessment. We found out that the TKELS was developed and commissioned by the IES, and it's psychometrically sound in its original form. It's reliable and valid. So we first worked with the program team to think about what are the questions we're adding to the instrument and what are we removing, right? And the goal here was to make sure it's really well aligned to the content of the program that we're offering. Once we did that, we then had to reestablish the validity. So when you take an instrument and you modify it, and if it's already reliable and valid, you have to reestablish those psychometric properties. Because we weren't making too drastic of a change, we were only adding and removing a couple of questions, we didn't feel like we had to reestablish all of the various types of validity, but we did have to reestablish construct validity. And construct validity really talks about, is the instrument measuring the thing you think it's measuring, right? So is it appropriately aligned to intent, constructs, wording, relevance, things like that. So we try to reestablish construct validity by establishing a panel of experts who were really familiar with the course's content. Next slide, please. And what we asked the panel of experts to do is go through a validity protocol that the research and evaluation team of the organization developed. So first we asked the experts to go through all of these questions independently and individually, and then we brought them together to arrive at consensus. And I won't go through the entire protocol. It's in front of you. You can see it. It's also in the case study in the white paper. But we basically asked the experts to answer some questions. And these questions were around what are the constructs that the instrument is trying to measure, the modified instrument? Does it measure the thing that we think it's measuring? Are some areas of knowledge overrepresented? Are some areas underrepresented? Is the wording of all the questions clear? Things like that. So really making sure that the instrument is aligned to the program, especially because we're now modifying it. Once we felt like we had the answers to these questions, we felt like we had reestablished construct validity. Next slide, please. And so now we're going to roll out the modified TK-ELS and use it to assess teacher knowledge pre and post OERA. But like Stacy mentioned earlier on with some of the challenges that we face, modifying an existing tool saves us time and effort because we're not developing something on our own. But if we're modifying it, then to the point that I was talking about, we have to reestablish the psychometric properties, which requires time and effort. It requires training the organization. It requires a certain type of expertise. All professional learning organizations are pretty committed to using validated instruments, but these are hard to come by, especially because we don't have this bank of instruments that are really perfectly tied to our work. And so this is a challenge that we face, that we want to use rigorous instruments, but either we develop our own or we sort of modify the ones in the field. And moving forward, Unbound Ed is working to reestablish the reliability of this instrument. But again, that requires time and expertise. I look forward to your questions. But again, this is an attempt to highlight the kinds of challenges that we face as professional learning organizations. I'm going to hand it off to Katie.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. My name is Katie Buckley. I am a senior research scientist at Teach for America, or TFA. I'm going to share a little bit more about our journey in embedding a new professional development system called Cultivate for Coaches, in our educator support model alongside our partners at the Consortium for School Research. As many of you probably know, TFA recruits and develops a diverse core of educator leaders who make an initial 2-year commitment to teach in a high-need school. Each year, TFA brings in a cohort of around 2,000 core members who receive intense training the summer before they enter the school, which is really grounded in anti-racist teacher leadership. We also employ coaches who directly support our core members in developing the skills and competencies to do this work. Importantly, in 2020, we established a rather ambitious 10-year goal, By 2030, twice as many children in communities where we work will reach key educational milestones, indicating they are on the path to economic mobility in a future filled with possibility. Next slide, please. So Cultivate for Coaches includes a student survey on classroom conditions and learning mindsets and strategies for students in grades 5 through 12. As the name suggests, it's really intended to provide data so that our coaches and our core members, our educators, can talk about their core member practice based on student feedback. However, importantly for this webinar, the student survey data will also provide us with an organizational-wide understanding of our impact on student experiences grounded in student voice, an often overlooked data source in education and in teacher professional learning, as Krista had talked about. As we began exploring Cultivate, we realized it was really aligned to the work TFA was already doing and had hoped to do, including the learning conditions we prioritize for core member development, our orientation to coaching feedback and development with our core members, and the focus on student survey data to shape classroom experiences. We also saw a lot of value in its aligned progress monitoring tool, Elevate, which is intended to support our core members in monitoring their progress between Cultivate survey administrations. However, we knew that embedding Cultivate in our programmatic support model would be a huge undertaking, requiring considerable capacity on the part of our core members and our coaches. So for the last 2 years, we've been working very closely with the Chicago Consortium through a formal research practice partnership to embed Cultivate in TFA. Next slide. Thank you. So for our core members, we're asking them to take on administering an entirely new survey and understand how to use the data to drive their practice. And this is on top of being a first or second year teacher, new to teaching, and placed in under-resourced schools. To alleviate some of the capacity constraints in our core members, we have fully embedded Cultivate throughout the core member experience, beginning in that pre-service before they start teaching all the way throughout the year, so that Cultivate isn't seen as an add-on to the work that they're doing, and the survey administration is not seen as supplemental to the work. The training that they receive is really grounded in the importance of eliciting student voice to improve classroom conditions for social, emotional, and academic development, which is at the core of Cultivate. And the training begins immediately when core members start their journey at TFA, and continues throughout, using coaching, learning, and professional communities, learning communities and professional learning communities. For our coaches, as the name suggests, Cultivate for Coaches, it really requires additional capacity to ensure our coaches not only support our core members in survey administration, but also understand how to use the data to help our core members improve their own practice. And so to alleviate some of the capacity constraints, we really sought to reimagine the role of a coach to really focus on classroom outcomes beyond academics by centering student perceptions of their classroom experiences. And so Cultivate is now weaved into core coaching moments and foundational coaching tools and resources. We have a core member learning plan, which enables our core members and our coaches to have consistent opportunities to reflect on, identify, and support changes in core member practice. Next slide, please. Obviously, this is a huge undertaking, and so we really sought to embed Cultivate across TFA staff roles and responsibilities in much the same way as a district would work to embed a new professional development training across schools, including data sharing agreements, survey administration operations, survey response tracking, and coach and core member training. Final slide, please. For us, scaling doesn't just mean increasing the number of core members participating in survey administration, but really ensuring that we have organization-wide core member and staff commitment to bringing in student voice to drive changes in practice. And as we scale, we are committed to sharing with the field what we are learning about our implementation challenges and successes, our student experiences in our core member classrooms, and TFA's impact towards ensuring every core member is trained in creating equitable learning conditions and environments. I will now turn it over to Laura and Tim from Leading Educators.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Miley. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Leading Educators, and Leading Educators really exists to ensure excellent and equitable teaching for all students. And we do that in partnership with leaders and teachers across the school system. So we work with district leaders and teachers and school leaders and teacher leaders all together focused on impact for kids. And we've been really excited to see impact for students who are supported through Leading Educators program. So on the next slide, I'm going to get the chance to share a little bit about our enabling conditions tool, which I think goes really nicely with the other case studies where we've heard about Teaching Lab's work to think about a whole system of measures, and then measures that are more focused on teachers and students. And this condition measure is one that helps us really look at the work of leaders and the conditions that they're creating to support work in classrooms. And so when Leading Educators started about 12 years ago, we were a fellowship that supported teacher leaders specifically, and we heard from teacher leaders that they loved being supported and getting leadership development. But when they went back to school, some of the pieces weren't in place for them to be the most effective leaders possible. So they might not have time to coach other teachers. They might not have resources for their PLCs, or their principal might have different priorities. And so we started working not only with teacher leaders, but also with school leaders, where we heard similar stories that they wanted more alignment with the district leaders. And so we really worked ourselves back to working with all layers of a system based on the experiences of participants that we worked with. And so once we did that, we realized that one of the things that we really craved and that our participants really craved was a clarity of vision of what's most important at the school and system levels when it comes to thinking about professional learning that matters for kids. And so because of that, we created the school conditions and system conditions framework, which you'll see samples linked in our case study, and I'll also pop them in the chat there. Oh, thanks, Krista. You're one step ahead of me. So on the next slide there, you'll see just a brief glimpse at the highest level, sort of the focus of the 6 different conditions. So they focus on the vision for instruction and how it ties in excellence and equity, the role of stakeholders and how ownership is shared across all different layers of leaders, the clarity of roles and responsibilities, resources like curricula and assessments, the focus of professional learning and the time that's allocated there, and then also how the cycles of data and learning are ongoing to make sure that learning translates into practice and into outcomes for kids. So in that link that Krista chatted, you'll be able to see a little bit more, some sample indicators and examples, and we would love to and be happy to talk more about this with anybody who would like to go into more detail. I did want to share on the next slide just one story of how the conditions have played out in practice. So one of our partnerships currently is with the Charleston County School District. And I'll just give you a second to kind of skim through a little bit of the before and after when it comes to their system changes after working in partnership. So you'll see there some shifts in the access to high quality curricula for students, in the clarity of roles and the supports when it comes to coaching, to the amount of planning time that teachers now have to focus together on instructional priorities at the school level, and then to greater focus when it comes to the district level PL2. So really trying to think about what are all the pieces within a system and within schools that could get more aligned so that we can ensure that all kids and all teachers have access to high quality supports. And we were really excited just a couple of weeks ago on the next slide to see some of the most recent results coming out of Charleston for students. And so since we started partnering with Charleston in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, we've been really excited to see that putting the different conditional supports in place and then building the systems of ongoing professional learning for teachers and students has led to students really outpacing their growth before the pandemic, and in some cases matching or exceeding the growth of the most advantaged schools in Charleston, even as we target our focus on the students farthest from opportunity. So we're really excited about the growth of students and about the work that teachers and leaders are putting in to see not only the conditions being in place, but tracking those conditions all the way across the layers of outcomes to make sure that we're measuring the impact of PL where it matters most with kids. And so on the last slide here, you'll see just that we feel really excited about the common language that the conditions have created. We hear that from our partners as well. It helps them really have a roadmap for the work that they're doing, helps them prioritize and focus, helps them celebrate, identify areas to further develop, and then create priority areas. And we're really excited about the improvements that we see in conditions over the course of work together with district leaders. So we see 86% of schools improving on at least one condition after a year, more than half improve on half or more of the conditions. And so we're really excited to continue to learn from this measure and to offer it as a support for leaders as they think about their critical role to play in supporting teachers and students. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll go ahead and pass it back to Krista.
Thanks, Laura. And a huge thanks for all of our orgs that could be here today and sharing their experiences and expertise. I'm going to turn it over now to Nate to discuss the rest of our white paper.
Thanks, Krista. So what I think is so neat about listening to all those different case studies is how much effort each of these organizations is putting into doing the right kind of measurement to actually figure out whether the work they're doing is making a difference. The thing that I think is stunning about that is how much work it is for each of these organizations, right? And if you imagine the amount of capacity it takes for individual organizations and the push and pull that each one of them described between creating custom measures that take a lot of work and are not necessarily validated, and working with existing measures that don't actually get at the key points that they want to measure. And so what we're thinking about, both as Ripple as an organization, but also for each of these individual groups, is what is the work that we can all do together that will make this easier in the future. If you move to the next slide. The white paper lays out what we think of as recommendations, or sort of a call to action for each of these groups individually. And then we are also working as Ripple to create coherence across all these groups. But when we think about the individual groups as individual groups, we talk about, for PL organizations first, you can put that back, this idea of creating collaboration across all these organizations. So given the individual validation projects and the individual frameworks that organizations are building, how can we create more coherence across PL organizations by building opportunities for collaboration? What we ask for researchers is that researchers think about measurement a little bit differently than we've seen previously. So researchers tend to create these large scales for a single narrow construct that feel not easily adapted. And so we ask researchers how they can make things that are more adaptable, and how they can then make sure that the tools are all available so that they're easy to find and easy to use by organizations like the ones you just heard from. We ask school and district partners to build this type of measurement work into the process that they have with PL organizations. So over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, we've seen many more school and district organizations think about their work in partnership with PL organizations as building out high quality instructional systems. But if that high quality instructional system doesn't include a look at data and a sort of pipeline that creates data that flows directly from the school district to the PL organization and back, so that both of them are looking at the same evaluation data points, there's a big breakdown, which is what we talk about in this paper. But we think that requires more systemic work as well. And so we're hoping that one of the things that comes out of this white paper is a realization on the part of funders, and many funders already realize this, but that this work takes time and effort, and it takes money. And so we're asking funders to really commit to this work, to getting us all toward a point of coherence where we think that we're all working together on a similar measurement framework. And finally, we talk about policymakers seeing this as part of their work too, that this is not just, if we think of this as an individual district problem or an individual PL organization problem, then we don't get past this stage where we're all doing things in a fragmented way. And so we need better frameworks coming at the state level to kind of make this easier on all of us. And we think that Ripple can play a part in making this happen. So I will pass it to Stacy, who's going to talk about how we're trying to make that happen.
Thanks, Nate. So I was going to say, so how is Ripple going to carve out a piece of this? What is going to be our role in this work? And so as we worked with our members, as we worked with our affiliates, as we had more conversations about measurement over the past year, it just crystallized what we already knew to be true, which is that measurement is a key enabling condition that will allow Ripple and everybody in the PL field to advance our visions and missions around creating educational equity for all students, particularly students at the margins of our classrooms. And so in 2024, Ripple is going to grow and build greater coherence in the PL measurement space. It has to happen. It has to happen now. It has to happen alongside the research that we're doing. And so we will do that by continuing to build a data infrastructure repository that will allow for greater field-wide access to anonymize de-identified secondary data for analysis and learning. We will, in partnership with our network, develop a Ripple-vetted shared measurement compendium around all things related to teacher and educator professional learning. We recognize that there are a number of different actors in our field, from PL organizations to research institutions to funders, who are also attempting to advance this. Our goal is not to duplicate, but instead to bring together. And so we're really excited about that, and really excited that many of the other actors in the field doing this work are already affiliated and are members of Ripple. And then finally, we will use these things to launch a set of contributing studies, right? So our contributing studies in 2024 will leverage these resources to help us answer questions that are posed in our learning agenda to help us get at educational equity for all students. With that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Before I do, I just want to again thank all of our workgroup members who spent now what it is 6 months in total having these conversations, coming to consensus, doing writing, doing thinking, challenging the work in really meaningful ways, and then volunteering their time and energy after we birthed this together to hold a series of webinars and brown bags for us to speak about it more widely. And so with that, I just invite folks to come off of mute. Feel free to ask questions. I've also been monitoring the chat, so I can kick us off. I think that Katie from TFA responded to Rachel's question, but I just want to give space for maybe something more, Katie. And Rachel asked, she was curious about how you developed your source survey constructs in your work.
Yeah, so the student survey has sort of a long lineage of surveys that have been administered in the Chicago Public Schools, led by the consortium. The Cultivate for Coaches survey actually comes from the Cultivate for Schools survey that is currently being administered in Chicago Public Schools. But our partners at the consortium recognize that we didn't need that feedback on the school from our students in the school wasn't going to help us directly support our teachers. And so they kind of reconfigured the survey so that the questions that were being asked were directly about the classroom in which the students were being served by a core member. So when we got the data back, we're getting it back about our core members as opposed to at the school level, like a lot of surveys are. So it's a survey that has been in existence, it's been validated, but really kind of configured for our purposes.
Thanks, Katie. I'm gonna go to Marianne. She put a question in the chat. Must PL providers pay to join affiliate in order to obtain the measurement resources, or are they OER? I think I need to pull apart this question. So first, let me go to the OER portion of the question and have somebody respond to that. And then I'll respond to the broader question about resources as it pertains to Ripple. I think this is you, Laura.
I think so. Currently, we don't have it publicly OER, but we are definitely in the process of thinking about that. So, Marianne, I'm happy to follow up with you and anybody else who wants sooner access to those as we make the internal decision. So I will pop my email in the chat and happy to follow up.
And I would just add, from the Ripple space, whatever we develop is open access for our network. And we're exploring ways to make that more publicly open. I think in some cases it will be based on funding. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Laura, for popping that in the chat. Are there other questions if folks want to come off mute? We have about 7 more minutes for Q&A. Otherwise, I will start asking questions. I'm happy to do that. And I can't see everybody. I can only see our panelists. So feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat. Okay, so then I will ask a question. So one big question for, oh, no, go ahead.
Brian Pick, I have a question. Brian Pick from Schusterman Family Philanthropies.
Hi, Brian, go ahead.
In the end of the paper, you speak a little bit about where we go from here, and you have the role of the PL organizations, the researchers, the school partners, and the funders. Can you speak a little bit more about where you're seeing success and a little bit about the appetite and some of the challenges of where school partnerships are at this point, and the capacity of school offices and districts to work in partnership on linking or using or finding high quality measures to see if their PL is working? What are you finding so far from the district partnership side?
I think this is a great question for any one of our panelists, so I'm looking to them.
You can get started, but I'm conscious of not wanting to talk too much. So we are finding both exciting spots and places where there are challenges in terms of data access, I would say, is kind of the headline that I would put. I think everybody that we partner with, and I have no doubt our organization and all the organizations on this call really care about the impact of what we're doing and being able to measure that. And I recognize two like really significant and important barriers in terms of wanting to be mindful of teachers and leaders and students' capacity, and not wanting to over survey, to over assess kids, and to be really thoughtful about the utility of each additional measure or the opportunity to kind of streamline measures thoughtfully. So that's one piece. And then, of course, concerns around data sharing and wanting to be really mindful of student and family privacy is something that is a constant kind of constant idea that we're navigating alongside our district partners. And so we're really working to make sure that data sharing and the measurement of PL work is just as important at the beginning of a partnership as talking about what is the PL and what are we going to do together, but how will we know that what we're doing together matters for kids is just as important. And so we're really working together to be mindful of those two considerations. And so I think making a lot of progress and also really wanting to be sensitive to the real challenges there, and the concerns. I'm curious what others think or what you all would add or change.
Eliza came off mute, so I want to, yes.
I think Laura covered everything. The piece that I would add is there's clearly some self-selection here, right? So the districts that are partnering and are working with us are the districts who are probably more likely to be invested in measurement and evaluation and research, right? So our partners are likely not indicative of all of the districts in the country. So I think there's a little piece of that. The ones that we're working with are really excited. I think Laura noted a really important challenge that even if district leaders, for example, are really invested in working with us, the reality on the ground is different, and they are trying to manage sort of the two needs, right? Where they're invested in understanding what works and for whom and what context, but at the same time, to Laura's point, they don't want to overburden their teachers and their principals and their students. So I think something that we're outlining in this paper is that we're searching for those concise measures that don't fatigue our participants on the ground, that are sort of consistent so multiple people can use it, and then really get to the answers that both the PL organizations want to get at, but also funders and researchers and districts. And then the last piece that I'll add there is, the capacity constraints, but some of the districts that we work with are also working in very tricky political contexts, right? Depending on their states and sort of what guidelines are coming down from the top. And so there's also that sensitivity that we need to manage around. There might be an interest, but they might be politically tied or unable to do the kinds of work that they're interested in, we're interested in. So it's also about navigating that space.
Can I add too? I don't work for one of these PL orgs, so I'm just speaking from observation, but it feels to me like there are confusing pieces about ownership of all this measurement. So who is actually gathering this data? Is it the PL org or the district? And how does this interact with, right? We're usually talking about surveys for teachers and potentially students too. We're talking about observations, and we're talking about looking at various types of student outcomes. The student outcome data is already gathered by the district, and the hard part there is putting in place the agreements to get that data to flow back and forth. But when you're talking about surveys and observations, you're talking about new types of data gathering. And I think the question of whether or not that district should be in charge of that or PL org should be in charge of that is not one that is easily answered. And then it also interacts with, there's just been so much more measurement that is asked of districts these days, right? Like districts are already usually doing their own student surveys. Most districts are doing their own teacher surveys at this point. And figuring out how do we augment what's already going on versus just asking for a new one feels really, really important. And I haven't seen a lot of places that have come up with good systems for, right? If you bring in, like, if you're a district and you're already giving your own student or teacher survey and you bring a new partner on, is there a way that you could have a module added to your current survey versus asking them to, versus a new survey that comes at a different time of year or something like that? So I think there are systems that we could create. I don't think those systems have been created in most places yet. And it would be really interesting to talk with people on this webinar, members of this group, about what would it look like to create those sort of district systems that make it easier to expand and contract data collection over time as priorities change.
Thanks, Nate. Katie?
I will add to that, because this definitely come up as we've been trying to implement surveys, student surveys across our core members. One of the sort of key talking points that we've really sort of emphasized is this isn't just about TFA collecting data on our teachers. This is really like a professional development system wrapped around a student survey. And so the idea is that we are giving data back to the teacher about their classrooms that they can then use to improve their own practice. And in fact, a lot of school leaders have then said, well, can we get access to this data as well? And we've been hesitant there because we don't want this to be punitive or evaluative in any way. But we've sort of said to our core members, if you are in a school where you feel comfortable, where there's a data culture, where you can bring this data and have these conversations and feel like it's done in a, authentic, vulnerable space, then please do. But that's ultimately up to you as a core member, because this is something that is for your development first and foremost, and then for TFA secondly.
Thanks, Katie. There's a question from Catherine. She was noting that Teaching Lab's Gusky model was highlighted, and she's wondering about future work of Ripple around measuring PL and if we've considered investigating other PL models. She mentions DeSimone and colleagues and how they relate to potential future PL measurement tools. I want to give space, Shay, if you have a comment here. I will just say at a high level from Ripple's perspective, we recognize that there are many, many frameworks right now around professional learning and what works. We have the standards for professional learning as an example. We have CBPL, right, curriculum-based professional learning, and the elements. We have a lot of literature from scholars in this space. And I think one of the goals for Ripple, along with partners from our membership and affiliates, is to interrogate those. And instead of saying that there is a preferred framework, to highlight what is cross-cutting across all of the frameworks so that we can align around a set of core pieces that we can all agree on and think about how we're all defining them collectively. But I'm going to pause there and let Shay respond to why perhaps you chose the Gusky model as opposed to other models and what it does and does not do. And I think you alluded to that a bit, but here's some more space for you to go further.
Again, I would just say, I think it just provides a simple framework, like as a starting point. Again, I think I mentioned that some of the disadvantages we see is that it is very linear, and there are definitely ways we can kind of probe about this model about, do you need success? Do teachers have to like what they're learning to see results? How does that process of learning and the mindset shifts happen, and how do they interact with practice and student outcomes? But I think overall it gives a good roadmap of the different elements that we should be thinking about in the different areas of data collection. I agree with what Stacy said. I'm not sure it's really like what we're trying to do in Ripple is look at the different models, but again, what are the elements that are in common, and among those, doing research to figure out what types of design features, are most impactful, kind of maybe regardless of that underlying model.
Thanks, Shay. So we are close to time. I did want to close with one question, and then I'm going to pass it to Krista. But that question is for our panelists. I didn't have a person in mind, so whoever can come off and answer, I would appreciate it. If 5 years from now, we've made great strides and inroads, right, in measurement across the PL field, what would measurement look like? What would you hope to see when thinking about partnerships between PL orgs, districts, and researchers? Just high level, I would walk in and I would see this happening. What is that thing? You could even popcorn it. Thoughts from the panelists?
I would regularly see PL, professional development, coaching, thought of as a cycle that not only has learning for adults at the beginning, but would have data from students in a regular cadence that informs all of the priorities for adults in an ongoing way. And that data would be triangulated.
Thanks, Laura. I love it. Okay, let's stop there, and I'll pass it to Krista to close us out.
Thank you. So with that, on behalf of the Ripple team, a huge thanks to our org presenters for being with us, and to all of you for joining today. Ripple is excited to continue collaborating with our organizations as we build and innovate in the measurement space. So the recording, slides, and survey will be sent out tomorrow to all registrants and participants of today's webinar. If you're wondering how your organization can be more involved with Ripple and our work, please email me. We will be opening an affiliate application cycle in January, and I'm happy to talk to folks who have questions about affiliation. I'd also like to encourage everyone to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, and connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter to stay up to date on what Ripple is working on. So have a wonderful rest of your weeks, and please let us know what you thought of today's webinar and how Ripple can expand shared learning opportunities by taking our survey in the chat now. And again, will be sent out tomorrow in the follow-up email. Thanks, everyone.